All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Molt 101. I know Colin's really excited to present about this, and I'm really excited to learn. I feel like I'm going to learn a lot of stuff today. So thank you so much for joining us and for being on time. We'll be answering questions through the chat, but we'll also have some time at the end of the presentation for us to answer some questions as well. So this webinar will be pretty interactive, so we'll interact through that chat function. And I'm going to pass it over to Colin and take it away.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Tyler. I am really excited to be talking to you all today about molt. This is a topic that I get really excited about. It's something that I can, if I'm not careful, I can just kind of keep rambling on and go off on all sorts of tangents. So one of my challenges today is going to be to try to stay on topic and keep us moving through these slides. But we will definitely have time for questions at the end. And I will also try to look at the chat box every once in a while just to maybe address some questions as they are popping up. So most of us should be probably pretty familiar with Zoom by now, but in case you are not, you can find the chat box by looking at the taskbar menu within Zoom, and it's just that little kind of bubble that's circled right here. And so that's how what we'll be using to interact with each other as we go along today. And yeah, here we are. So my name is Colin Woolley. I am the banding coordinator for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And so I run our bird banding stations, and bird banding and molt kind of go hand in hand. So that's why I'm presenting today on molt. My favorite bird is the brewer sparrow pictured above there, and it's kind of always been my favorite bird. I think almost anytime somebody asks me, that's going to be it, because it's the first bird that I really spent a long time kind of watching and studying, and felt like I got to know it really well. So my favorite bird is the brewer sparrow. We're also joined by Tyler. Tyler's our camp and community coordinator, and his bird probably changes a little more often, but for the moment, it's the Oregon dark-eyed junco pictured down below, a bird that's been showing up in his yard a lot recently. A good wintertime bird here in Colorado. If you want to use the chat box right now, just to let us know where you are tuning in from, and perhaps what your favorite bird is, or what the last really cool bird that you saw was, and also if there's more than one, if there's several of you watching, and just include how many folks are joining you today. Tyler's favorite bird is still the junco. That's great. That hasn't changed since yesterday when I asked him. We've got someone from Lakewood who just saw an immature bald eagle fly over 15 minutes. That's super cool. Where I live, I don't see them fly over hardly ever, but where I work out at Bar Lake, we'll see them quite a bit. Ooh, Florida, cool. And Western kingbird, that's a rare bird out there in Florida. We get them a fair bit here in Colorado. Lewis's woodpecker, one of my favorite birds. Cool. Well, thanks for sharing your favorite bird and where everybody's tuning in from. We are going to start by just talking a little bit about, there we are, about our organization, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving birds and their habitats. So we do this through kind of a three-pronged approach of science, education, and land stewardship. And so our science team is doing original research, doing a lot of field research, and publishing those findings. And our stewardship team is often using those findings and working directly with landowners, especially private landowners, ranchers, farmers, and helping them to implement good, solid conservation practices on their land. And then our education team is trying to share that information as much as we can with the public. And so in my position as a banding coordinator, I work kind of with the science team and the education team. And Tyler is with the education team. And this whole webinar series that we're doing periodically throughout the year is one of the big pushes with our education team, is to get more information out there and let people know how cool birds are. So thanks again for joining us. And we are going to jump into molt. All right, so these are some of our goals for the webinar today. We are going to talk about what molt is. We're going to define it. We're going to learn why it's important for bird survival. We're going to learn about the various molt strategies that different birds use. And there is a lot of variation there, but we'll tease it apart. And we're going to learn how molt can drastically change a bird's appearance. It's a tool they use, among other things, to change the way they look. And we're going to look a little bit also at how having some understanding of molt can enhance our field identification of birds. And we'll take a look at some examples of that. All right, so molt historically has been a very challenging and difficult topic to follow. There's been a lot of research on molt over the years, but it's been very confusing because it's very full of jargon. There's a lot of very specific words that mean specific things. And just to show a list of some of those words that you see if you're reading through the molt literature, it's kind of overwhelming. Basic, alternate, definitive, eccentric, suspended molts, abridged, prenuptial, postnuptial, the list goes on and on. I'm not going to read them all, but you start to get a sense of, just how confusing it can be. And part of this came from two different systems more than two different systems of describing molts that were developed in North America and also in Europe. And scientists in those different regions were using different words to describe the same thing. And then just a lot of confusion, frankly, over the thing itself, over molt and the different patterns that birds use. And so really over the last probably 2 decades or so, there's been a bigger push in the scientific molt research community to find a consistent language, to develop some stable terminology that's going to be more applicable to all birds all over the world, whether you're in North America or in Europe or in the Southern Hemisphere, to develop a terminology, a way of talking about this that's universal. And so we're gonna dive into some of those universal terms, and a lot of the terms that are listed here on our jargon page are a bit redundant, and some of them are outdated, so we won't get into all of these. All right, so what is molt? It's pretty simple, really. It's just the process of feather replacement. So feathers are super amazing structures that allow birds to do all sorts of things. Probably the most important of which is they're so lightweight and so strong structurally that they allow birds to fly. Excuse me, but they do wear out over time. They're not able to heal themselves. They get beat up, they get worn out, and they're not going to last forever. They have to be replaced. And so molt is that physiological process following specific patterns that birds use to replace their feathers. And they'll do it at least once a year. Many birds do it more often than that. Birds also have the ability to replace, if a single feather falls out, maybe a single tail feather or a single wing feather, they can replace that feather right away. It'll start to grow in, soon after it falls out. Some people call that like adventitious molt, and it's just, the replacement of a single feather that might have fallen out. And I'm not referring, when we talk about molt, at least in this presentation, I'm not talking about that so much. I'm going to be talking more about the specific kind of annual cycle that birds go through to replace their feathers. All right, so let's take a look at the annual cycle of a bird. In the annual cycle of a bird, there's really 3 big energetic investments that are going to happen in any given year. All right, so we're going to put molt kind of in the context of what else, the other things that birds are doing throughout the year. One of the biggest, maybe the biggest, arguable, breeding, right? Takes a lot of energy to nest, takes a lot of energy to breed. The second of the big three is migration. Huge amounts of energy are put into for migratory birds flying, from North America to Central or South America. That's an incredible energetic investment. And our third surprise is molt. So in the annual cycle of a bird, these are kind of the big three energetic investments. And in general, they tend not to overlap because you don't want to be, you only have so much energy that you can afford to spend at any given time. And so most birds, they're not molting if they're breeding. They wait till they're done breeding. We tend to see molts happen after they're breeding and not during, because that would be just, too energetically taxing. So these three kind of big energetic investments are usually spaced out throughout the course of the year, so they're not really going to overlap. And if we take a look at breeding and think about what breeding is in terms of the energy that's invested, it's really an investment in the next generation of birds. It takes a lot of energy to raise young. You have to find a mate, you have to build a nest, you have to sit on that nest for a long period of time, or bring food to a mate that's sitting on the nest. And then you have to feed those young until they're able to take care of themselves. So that takes a ton of energy. And also, some birds, especially if resources are scarce, they may even skip breeding. Not all birds breed every year, especially in more desert environments. If it's an extreme drought, some birds, there may not be enough food resources. They may skip breeding entirely, or if food resources are hyperabundant, they may nest multiple times. So breeding is something that can come and go even within the annual cycle of a bird. Doesn't necessarily happen every year. If we take a look at migration, that's a major energetic investment in travel, and traveling to find suitable habitat for breeding or wintering, and traveling to return to those same breeding grounds year after year. But not all birds migrate, and not all birds migrate super far. There's less than half of the bird species out there are long distance migrants, and again, many are resident birds year round that may not be migrating really at all. And so in contrast to both of those, feather molt is a really big energetic investment if you're a bird in yourself. You're going to invest all that energy into growing yourself a shiny new set of feathers. It's got nothing to do with nesting, with investing in the next generation, or investing in going to a new place through migration. It's that time for self-renewal. And all birds molt every year. Again, not all birds migrate, not all birds breed every year. All birds, every single bird on the planet molts every year. And it's about that, that self-renewal, that self-investment. So if you're a bird, it's kind of like your spa day. It's your time to treat yourself, get yourself some new, shiny new feathers. All right, so why do birds molt? There's a couple of main kind of purposes that it serves, and the biggest that we've touched on already is that structural renewal, just replacing those old worn out feathers. We're going to take a close look pretty soon here at kind of the anatomy of a feather and how they wear out and why they wear out and what they lose, some of the functionality that they lose as they wear out. But not only that, so structural renewal is probably kind of the biggest reason that birds molt, but it's also about appearance alteration. Birds may go from a juvenile, really cryptic plumage that provides a lot of camouflage, all the way through to these what we call breeding plumages, like we see on this super bright, colorful, flashy male Western tanager. And they don't look like this year round, and it's because they're molting in and out of this breeding plumage. Okay, so let's take a closer look at structural renewal. When feathers are growing in, and this is what's shown in the top photo, they're said to be, we refer to them as being in pin. And you can see that it kind of looks like little pins that are growing up, and they have this shaft around them that protects the feather, and the feather's actually kind of alive at that point. It's got blood flowing to it. It's bringing in nutrients that are going to, help that feather grow. But once that feather has grown in all the way, that shaft kind of wears away, and then the feather itself is inert. It's done growing. The blood flow is cut off to that feather, and once it's reached that stage where it's fully grown, it can't heal itself. It's a dead structure. So over time, it's just going to wear out. Some of the structures of it are going to wear out, and it's going to get more and more beat up over time. And there's a lot of different strategies birds use to kind of reduce the rate of wear on their feathers. But it's a one-way street. They can only get more and more worn out through time until eventually you have to replace them. The single biggest damager of feathers, the single biggest thing that causes wear and tear on feathers is sunlight, UV damage, just from, birds are out often in open habitats where they're exposed to a lot of UV sunlight. And that is the single biggest damager of feathers. So we're going to take a close look at the anatomy of a feather here. So we're looking at one feather, and if we zoom in, so we have the central shaft that you can see there. It's called the rachis, and then coming off of that are these what we call the barbs, which are just those lines that make up most of the feather. And then on the more microscopic level, coming off of those barbs are barbules, which are just kind of like little Velcro hooks. And even on those barbules, there's little, even smaller, more microscopic hooks or little hooklets. And so there's kind of this layered system of little hooks on each of these barbs and within each of these feathers that when they lay over each other, they lock in and they form a nice, tight, super strong structure. And that's what gives feathers their rigidity, so that they can fly through the air and not be flapping all over the place. This is what allows birds to zip their feathers up, so to speak. And they can't use, birds spend a lot of time preening, and what they're doing is they're moving their bill along their feathers and getting all those barbs and barbules to line up and interlock. But those little hooks that are at the tips of each of these barbules, they are susceptible to UV damage. They wear out, they physically break. And so over time, feathers lose their ability to interlock and make a nice, tight matrix. So they're very susceptible to wear and tear. And the other thing to point out is that the pigment melanin, which is the pigment that provides dark coloration to feathers, also provides a lot of UV protection. And so what you tend to see is that the influence of ultraviolet radiation, of UV damage on feathers, has a lot of important implications for the plumages that we see in birds and for the molt patterns that they follow. White or very pale feathers are going to wear out much more quickly than dark feathers. And so think about some birds that you might know that have white in them. And we're going to take a look at this one here. And if people know what this bird is, go ahead and type it in chat. I won't reveal it just yet. Anybody know what bird we're looking at here? Clark's nutcracker. Yes, somebody got it. Nice, Angela. All right, so we're looking at this Clark's nutcracker here. That top photo, we're seeing this bird in flight, and see all that white, right? It's got a lot of white. It's very flashy. When you see these Clark's nutcrackers in flight, you're seeing a lot of white moving around. But now look at the lower picture where the nutcracker is perched on the ground, And what happens to that white? It's hidden, right? It's hidden under these darker feathers. So especially looking at the tail, those outer white feathers that, again, would be much more damaged as they're exposed to solar radiation. When the bird is just sitting at rest, those feathers are protected under the darker upper tail feathers. So there's only a couple, two and a half, or sorry, three tail feathers that are dark, but they're providing protection because they're rich in that melanin that's more UV resistant. And so you tend to see this a lot, where birds that have white, it tends to be in the outer tail feathers. It tends to be in the inner flight feathers, and we see that with the Clark's nutcracker here as well. But when that bird is at rest, all that white nearly disappears. And it's because that white is so vulnerable to UV damage. And the dark feathers are vulnerable to it as well, but they're gonna hold up a lot better over time. So think about some other species that you might be familiar with that have a similar pattern to this. For example, Tyler's bird of the day was the dark-eyed junco. They have white in their outer tail feathers, but not throughout the entire tail. If birds had white on these middle tail feathers that were exposed to sunlight all the time, those tail feathers would disintegrate. They would wear out because they'd be so exposed to sun damage. So part of the way that birds kind of fight this UV damage is just through strategic placement of those paler, more delicate feathers. They tend to be in the outer tail. They tend to be on the underside of the bird where there's less UV exposure. But the other way that they combat this is it's molt. It's those feathers are still going to get worn out, and they're still going to need to be replaced. All right, we've got a couple patterns of feather replacement that I want to touch upon here. The first is going to be simultaneous molt. This is when all of the flight feathers, the main feathers of the wing, are dropped very quickly, and this pattern of molt results in a short period of flightlessness. So we see this in like ducks, grebes, cormorants do this, but in general, it's not very common. Most of the birds that we're familiar with that we see at our bird feeders or in our yards are not doing simultaneous molt. They are doing what we would call sequential molt, where they are dropping feathers a few at a time, and this allows them to maintain that ability to fly. And so you see this a lot, especially in larger birds like raptors, turkey vultures, maybe ravens. If they're flying around and sequentially molting, you'll see a visible gap in their wing, and that's molt. So they're replacing those feathers, one or two at a time, usually symmetrically. So the left and the right wing are kind of at the same stage, and they're still able to fly. They're able to maintain that flight ability as they are molting. Okay, this is super cool. So we know a little bit about the evolutionary history of molt, and that molt itself didn't start with birds. Feather molt didn't even start with birds. Birds inherited molt from their pre-bird dinosaur ancestors. And we've seen this in the fossil record, but it's something that we're still, there's still ongoing research and new findings coming up even now. And so this was a paper that was published just last year where they found a kind of a pre-bird feathered dinosaur that was fossilized while it was in active molt. And so this is super, super cool. This one little finding really kind of helped us advance our understanding of molt a fair bit. Because what we see is that this particular dinosaur that was molting, it was molting those flight feathers sequentially. So remember what we were just talking about, where birds that molt their flight feathers sequentially, that's really important for them because it helps them maintain, helps them maintain their ability to fly. So that tells us something about this pre-bird dinosaur, that maintaining flight or some sort of gliding ability that it was getting from its feathers was very important to it. So it was not going to molt simultaneously and lose that flight ability or that gliding ability. Okay, we're going to get a little bit heavy into the jargon now. It's a necessary evil when we're looking at molt. So we're going to go over a few terms here and take a look at some of our common molt strategies. All right, we're going to look at basic versus alternate. So these are two different types of molt. The basic molt refers to one annual molt, and usually in fall, and this is a bit of a North American bias, because if you're in the tropics, it could happen any time of year. But in general, for our birds that we are familiar with up here in North America, this basic molt is happening in the fall. And usually, especially in adult birds, this is a complete molt. So all of the feathers are replaced. All the body feathers, all the wing feathers, all the tail feathers, they are all replaced. All birds do this basic molt every year at a minimum. It's fundamental. It's something they inherited from dinosaurs, and they all do it. And if you look through the evolutionary history, you see it over and over and over. They all do it. A lot of birds have evolved additional molts, what we call inserted molts. And we call them that because they're inserted into this framework of the basic molt. So get that basic molt in your head. Once a year happens, all the feathers are replaced. Most birds also do other molts. So one of those other molts is the alternate molt. So this is an inserted second molt. And up here in North America, this usually happens in the spring. And in fact, for most birds, it'll happen on their wintering grounds before they arrive up here in North America. And it's usually restricted to the body feathers and maybe some of the wing coverts, but not those main flight feathers, not the primaries and tail feathers and so on. And this is the molt that, for species that have kind of a distinct breeding plumage, this is the molt that results in that distinct breeding plumage. Not all birds do this. So they all do that basic molt. Some, a little less than half up here in North America will do this alternate molt. And another terminology thing here is that molts are named after the plumage they result in. So a pre-alternate molt results in an alternate plumage. A pre-basic molt results in a basic plumage. So this is just again, we're getting into the weeds just a little bit, getting into some of the jargon, but it's necessary to keep moving along here. All right, our next kind of building block for different molt strategies is going to be simple versus complex. So a simple strategy has the same molt pattern year after year. So a bird that's employing a simple molt strategy, that first year is identical to the second year, is identical to the third year, the fourth year, and so on. Same pattern every year. This is actually super, super rare. Most birds have evolved these inserted molts. There's a few that haven't, and they still employ this simple molt strategy, but we're going to spend a lot more time talking about this next one, which is the complex molts. A complex strategy has an additional molt inserted into the first cycle. And so by cycle, I mean that first year before it's, when it's done, one of those pre-basic molts that they do every year, but before it's done its second one. They'll have this additional inserted molt that is called the pre-formative molt. So I know we're hitting a lot of the jargon here, but this pre-formative molt is going to be super important to understand because it is very, very common. Almost every bird, especially all the birds that you see out in your yard, they all do this. This is the most common molt strategy by far, is to have this extra inserted pre-formative molt that happens just in the first year. All right, so if we put those pieces together, we've got simple alternate and basic, and then simple and complex. We get 4 different possible molt strategies. So the first is simple basic, single complete molt each year. pretty rare. Not very many species actually do this. A few examples are albatross, some other seabirds, barn owls do this, but in general, not a very common strategy. Simple alternate strategy, even more rare. Not very many birds do this. This is 2 molts each year, but no additional inserted molts in that first cycle. So one example is herring gulls do this. Some of the other large, really large gulls do this, but not all gulls. These next 2 that we're going to talk about are way, way, way more common. So we've got our complex basic, and this is 1 molt per year, but with that extra additional inserted pre-formative molt that's going to happen in just that first cycle, but never again. And so this covers a lot of the birds that we are familiar with. A couple examples being American robin, song sparrow. Tends to be the birds that don't have a flashy breeding plumage. And then the last of our 4 strategies is the complex alternate strategy. So this is 2 molts each year. And again, in that first year with an additional inserted, that pre-formative molt is in there just in the first year. So this is birds like warblers, most warblers, yellow warblers, tanagers, birds that tend to have a colorful breeding plumage are following this strategy. And so these 2 strategies together, these bottom 2, these complex ones, make up most of the birds that we are familiar with. All right, we're going to dig into that pre-formative molt. I keep coming back to it. Super cool, super interesting, super important to understand. So we're going to dig into it a little more here. Pre-formative molt, why bother, right? Why have this extra molt that gets thrown in to that first year? The thing to understand is that when birds are in the nest, that's where their first basic molt takes place, that annual molt that's going to happen once a year. For a young bird that's in the nest, that happens in the nest. And it's synonymous with what, if you're into molt and you've looked at some of the literature before, they used to call this the pre-juvenile molt because it results in that juvenile plumage. But now, again, for finding common terminology, because it's a complete molt, we call it that first pre-basic molt now. And that first pre-basic molt, those feathers that grow in the nest are kind of junk. They're not very good. They have to, think about a bird that's growing all of those feathers at once. It's a baby bird. It's in the nest with maybe, 2 or 3 other young chicks. All of the energy that they're getting is brought to them by their parents, and it's spread out among those 3 or 4 chicks in the nest. And they're all having to grow a full set of feathers all at once, shortly, within a couple weeks. And so those feathers are really, really low quality because they're grown so quickly and they're just grown with less energy because those chicks aren't getting their own energy. They're getting it from their parents. And so without that pre-formative molt, these low quality juvenile feathers would have to last an entire year all the way up until the next complete that pre-basic molt that would happen the next year. Good luck. Those feathers are so kind of junk that they're not going to cut it. They're not going to keep that bird warm over the winter. That bird's going to lose its ability to thermoregulate. So that's why we see these inserted pre-formative molts. So it allows the birds to kind of replace those low quality juvenile feathers with some higher quality feathers from energy that they've gathered themselves once they're independent. And that will help get them through their first year and get them to their next basic molt in the next year when they're going to do it all over again and replace all those feathers. So you can think of this pre-formative molt as kind of a teenager molt. It's one that's going to bridge the gap between a juvenile bird and an adult bird. And we are going to take a close look at what exactly I mean by this when I say that those young juvenile feathers are kind of junk, because this is something we can actually see if we have a bird up close. So we've got a bird right here, and I'm going to hop over to the chat. Anybody know what bird we're looking at? When I said I was hopping over to the chat, yeah, I didn't even mean to spoil it there, but I kind of did, huh? Yeah, so this is a yellow-breasted chat. And we are gonna, I'll tell you that this chat is a teenager. It's in that teenager plumage. And it may be tough to tell, but we're gonna take a close look at how we can tell that this bird is a teenager. All right, we're gonna take a look at the wing of this chat. Ooh, there we go. So now we're looking at the chat's wing, and this wing is really where all the action is with these pre-formative molts. And it's because they are mostly replacing body feathers. Sometimes some birds will replace some of these flight feathers as well. Chats are a species that do this, where they, in that teenager pre-formative molt, they're gonna replace some body feathers, or excuse me, some flight feathers. And so what we're looking for is some contrast. We're looking for these newer formative feathers that are a little bit higher quality than the retained juvenile feathers. And so I would like to direct your attention to the area in this box here. All right. You may notice that the upper flight feathers, kind of closer to my thumb, look a little darker than the flight feathers right below that. And this is where we get into some fun CSI stuff here, all right? Are we ready? We're gonna zoom in on that, okay? All right, enhance. All right, we're zoomed in. We are looking at what we refer to as a molt limit. This is where the new molt started and started replacing some new feathers. So these two upper feathers with noticeably darker centers, noticeably darker shafts, are those formative teenager feathers. They're side by side with those kind of lower quality juvenile feathers. And they're lower quality partly because you can just see how they're not as dark. Remember, we talked about how melanin gives a lot of strength to feathers. So these two upper feathers that are replaced, newer, have more melanin. They're gonna last longer. They're gonna hold up better to UV damage. Furthermore, we were looking at the anatomy of a feather earlier, looking at the barbs, the barbules. On these newer replaced feathers, those barbs and barbules and little hooklets on the ends of the barbules are just more dense. There's more of them. And so they are providing more strength. And we can actually see this if we put a little dark line on the central shaft of each of these feathers. The upper feather is that teenager pre-formative, formative feather. And then the lower one is that juvenile feather. And we can count the barbs that come off in this distance. So it's the same length across each feather. And you can take my word for it. I actually went through and counted to see how many barbs there were coming off. And this upper one had 27 barbs. The lower feather had 22. So it's just, you know, these newer, more recently replaced feathers, those teenager feathers are just, they're denser, they're better, they're gonna last longer than these juvenile feathers. And so if you're ever at a banding station and you see banders sometimes wear these optivisors, these little kind of magnifying glasses on their head, and they're staring really closely at a wing, this is the sort of stuff that we're looking for. And it helps us find these teenager birds and pick them out. Okay, we're gonna jump back to these 4 molt strategies that are pretty common, or excuse me, of the 2 that are really common are both of these complex ones down below. We're gonna run through the annual cycle of just a couple of birds that kind of exemplify these strategies or use these strategies. So first we're gonna take a look at our hermit thrush. This is a bird that we get throughout most of North America, and they use the complex basic strategy. So we're looking at right now a hermit thrush that's in full juvenile plumage. It grew all these feathers simultaneously at the same time in the nest. And they're low quality feathers. They're gonna provide a little bit of camouflage, but they're not gonna last for very long. So this particular plumage, the juvenile plumage, is really short-lived. They leave the nest within usually a month or so. They're starting to do that teenager molt. So this plumage only exists for a relatively short period of time. And this is generally referred to in a lot of field guides as the juvenile plumage. But again, within a month, it's gonna go through that teenager pre-formative molt. And after it does that, it's gonna look like this. And this looks nearly identical to the adult because it's replaced all of the body feathers But one little clue that lets us know this bird is a teenager is that, and it's a little tough to see, but right in the middle of the wing here, some of these feathers have little buffy tips, and those are retained juvenile feathers. And this is something that if we have it up close in the hand at a banding station, we can see pretty well. In the field, these teenager birds look nearly identical to the adult bird. And so this teenager plumage is going to get it through the rest of the year, over the winter, through its first breeding season. And then in the fall, it's going to molt again, doing that basic molt. And then it'll look like this, nearly the same, except it's lost those little buffy tips. And this is that adult basic plumage, and it's just going to stay and molt once a year in the fall, and keep doing the same thing year after year and keep looking the same. All right, so that is our complex basic. Hermit thrushes, other thrushes, robins do this. A lot of sparrows, song sparrows, tends to be the birds that look the same year round. Chickadees are another that use this strategy. Our next strategy is going to be the complex alternate strategy. So we're going to take a look at a yellow warbler and the first year of the yellow warbler's life. So this is a yellow warbler that's fresh out of the nest. It's in that juvenile plumage. Again, it's not going to last very long. Then we are jumping to the formative plumage, that teenager plumage of a yellow warbler, a little more yellow. In field guides, this plumage is often referred to as first winter or immature. Again, it's that pre-formative plumage, that teenager plumage, that's kind of bridging the gap between juvenile and adult. So this will be what it's looking like for most of the winter. Come spring, it's going to go through an alternate molt and replace the body feathers, and it'll look mostly like an adult. So this is probably a young male yellow warbler in its first breeding season. It's got a little bit of those kind of orange streaky feathers coming in on the breast. And what's interesting here is that if we had this bird up close in hand, we would actually see 3 different generations of feathers. We'd see a few of those retained juvenile feathers, a few of those retained teenager formative feathers, and then most of the body feathers would all be that those first alternate feathers that it would have just replaced. This plumage in field guides is often referred to as a first summer bird, and sometimes it's nearly indistinguishable from any older bird. Then in the fall, it's going to go through that basic molt that happens every fall, and it will reach what's often in field guides referred to as an adult non-breeding plumage. So still pretty bright, nice, yellow streaking, but not quite as bright and flashy and showy as the adult breeding plumage in its second spring that it's going to molt into. And so this is generally, in field guides, this will be the adult breeding plumage for the males. And so in that first year and a half or so of a yellow warbler's life, it's going from juvenile to that teenager formative plumage, to the first alternate, to the adult basic, and then to the adult alternate. So that's 5, you can see my hand here, 5 different plumages that it's going through in that first year and a half or so. And then after that, it's just each year, it's going to do the basic molt in the fall, and then the alternate molt in the spring, and it'll cycle back and forth between those 2 for the rest of its life. Okay, so there we did it. We went through 2 of those most common strategies. All right, I wanted to circle back to one of our original questions was, why do we see bald birds? This is something that people who have feeders out have maybe seen birds, especially in jays and cardinals. Believe it or not, that's a cardinal down below. It hardly looks like it. But what's going on here? Any thoughts? So what we're looking at here is just, we talked a little bit about simultaneous molt, replacing all of a bunch of feathers all at once. And what we're seeing here is just the simultaneous, we'll get to pop up here. oops, simultaneous head feather molt. And so this is a strategy that we see in, some birds. Jays tend to do it, cardinals tend to do it. We also tend to see them when they're doing it because they come to our feeders. A lot of other birds do this too, but they're out, they're out in their environments and we aren't seeing it happening. And it's pretty short-lived. They're going to regrow these head feathers within a week, week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. But it's just they drop them all at once. Totally normal. Happens every year. Happens with old birds and young birds. So if you see this, it doesn't mean it's a young bird. Even the old birds do it too. And they look really goofy for a really short period of time throughout the year because they've dropped all their head feathers at once and they're undergoing a simultaneous molt of their head feathers. Yeah, we had a question, and I'm sorry, I've been kind of trying to glance at the chat, but I've probably missed some questions we'll circle back to. But Angela asks, what's the evolutionary benefit of simultaneous head feather molt? And that's a good question. I'm not sure. That's the short answer, is maybe a more study needed thing. It may be that there's no downside to it. It's somehow advantageous for them to just do it all at once, get it over with. They're still able to fly because they're not simultaneously molting those flight feathers. And so they're still able to, feed and forage and so on. And yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know. When does the head molt happen? So this is part of that basic molt that happens in these species. It happens in the fall. And it tends to be, I'm trying to think of how it works in relation to the rest of the feathers that are molting. And it can be a little variable. We tend to see it around the same time as it's starting to replace some of those flight feathers as well. Okay, we are near the end here. So I'm going to get through these last couple slides and then we can come back to different questions that people have. Here we go. Okay, molt and birding. I think having a working understanding of molt can really enhance your experience when you're out there bird watching. For example, this is a picture of a yellow grosbeak. This is a super rare bird that showed up in Colorado this past spring. And it's a bird that's normally found down in Mexico, but it showed up in Colorado for the first time ever that it's been documented there. It was a new state record and lots of birders were super excited to go and see it. And especially these days with the advent of really high quality digital photography becoming more and more accessible and more widespread, and more birders out there taking high quality photographs, we can do a lot with these pictures that people are taking. And so from this bird that was, again, a super rare bird that people were really into, we had loads of high quality photographs. And from those, we could zoom in, take a close look at the wing feathers of this bird, and we could tell. So you might see here in the wing that one black feather that's kind of sticking out relative to the others. And that's that teenager feather. That's that formative feather that's contrasting because it's so much darker than those kind of lower quality juvenile feathers. And so that tells us this bird was a teenager, so to speak. It was in its first spring. And so just by, getting a really close, good look at a bird in the field, sometimes you might be able to tell how old it is, or tell if it's male or female. And in fact, a lot of ongoing studies of molt are starting to use Macaulay Library. That's where the digital photo repository that eBird supports. If you're submitting photos through eBird, it goes in there. And because there's date and timestamps and location stamps for all of those photos, it's an incredible resource for people that are studying molt to look at birds. It used to be you had to go to a museum and look at specimens, and now we have these live specimens captured by photography coming in from all over the world. So it's an incredible resource. Okay, so what do we want to remember about molt is that birds inherited molt from their feathered dinosaurs, especially, and this is a topic we could spend a whole webinar about, but especially that basic molt and probably almost certainly the pre-formative molt. Those two especially are super ancient and came from dinosaurs. The alternate molts, not so much. Those have come and gone a number of times throughout kind of evolutionary history and different lineages of birds. Sometimes these alternate molts appear, sometimes they disappear. A big interesting topic of current molt study, but especially the basic and formative molts, dinosaurs. Molt is super fundamental. All birds do it every year. Not all birds breed every year, not all birds migrate every year. All birds are going to molt every year, at least once. And most birds, in addition to that one annual molt, will have additional inserted molts, that teenager molt, that pre-formative molt that results in that kind of that teenager immature plumage. And then a lot of birds also do that pre-alternate molt that gives them their breeding plumage. All right, and with that, we can jump into some questions. Let me pull up the chat here. And Tyler, if I missed any as we were going along.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I also, you all are able to unmute if you'd rather just ask your question in person, since we're a smaller group, or if you want to type that in, that's fine. We do have a question about the simple molt. You gave an example of like a barn owl that we could see in Colorado. Do you have any other examples of a bird that would undergo simple molt in Colorado? Like would a Canada goose?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm actually having a hard time thinking of any because they are super rare. So geese don't do it. Geese and duck molt is a bit of its own world, but they're not using that strategy. They're doing more of the they have extra inserted molts, so they're not following that strategy. It is really rare. So like I know some seabirds do it. Barn owls are their own. They're actually distinct from other owls. They're kind of a different lineage of owls. So the other owls don't, but barn owl does. Good question. No, I'd have to do some research. I actually don't know off the top of my head because it's that rare or unusual of a molt.
Awesome. And then you kind of answered this, but Norman was wondering, for birds that molt only in fall, over what time frame do they molt all of their feathers? Was it that year, kind of year and a half time frame? Yeah,
so the actual period of kind of active molt, when they're actively growing feathers, can last maybe a month or so. And so because they're dropping those flight feathers sequentially, and they don't want to drop them all at once because they want to still be able to fly, generally they wait till they're done nesting. So if I'm, say, an American robin and I finish my nest in late June, let's say, then July I'm raising my chicks. Maybe by late July I'm done with that. I'm done investing in my nest and my chicks, and now I'm ready to molt. So they might start that molt in late July, post breeding, and then it'll take them about a month to get through all their feathers.
Awesome. Those were the only questions that we had in the chat. But again, if anyone, I know that was a lot of information and we're probably digesting it a little bit. But if you have any other questions, feel free to type that into the chat. We'll stick around for a couple more minutes. Or just unmute yourself if you'd like. Yeah, Angela, you got your hand raised. Perfect. We can't hear you, Angela. You are unmuted.
There was a question Angela had in the chat. If this is the one, you could type it in chat if you're not able to speak out loud. Was that it seems disadvantageous to lack head feathers, going back to the birds that molt all their feathers at once, all their head feathers, and the bald birds that we might see. And it may be. I mean, they do it so quickly, and again, they tend to do it in the fall, in the early fall or late summer, and they're doing it up in these northern latitudes where the temperatures during that time of year, up here in Colorado in August, it's hot. Like you don't need the insulation of head feathers that time of year.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go. Hey, Angela.
I was talking on mute. Toming, I noticed you're recording this. Will we be able to watch this? Will this be available? There's a lot of great information, and I'd really like to have another shot at it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to upload this to YouTube probably later today, and then I'll send out that link to all the participants. And I'm also going to send out the PDF of these slides that are used. So I'll be able to go back and watch it.
Right on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So
And
Norman,
feel free, anybody who wants to, feel free to even email me any questions. If you have any nice photos of birds that are like inactive molt, and we can maybe tease apart what's happening. I love looking at that kind of stuff. So feel free.
yeah, and Norman was also asking, so all pre-basic molts are sequential. Is that?
Not all, but most. So the ones that aren't are like in ducks, or grebes, cormorants, like in Hinga, a few other lineages. I think loons do a simultaneous molt as well. But in all songbirds, most of the birds that we're familiar with and we see, all the raptors, it's sequential.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Colin. This was like a very, very informative. Ooh, do we have time to describe duck molt real quick? Any clips?
It gets kind of complicated. Yeah, it's interesting because ducks, we think of the alternate molt as the one that results in the breeding plumage, because that's what we see in songbirds. Ducks, it's kind of the opposite. They're more colorful plumage as a result of the pre-basic molt. And so they follow a bit of a different pattern, and it's one that I only know on a more surface level. It's not something I work with daily like I do with the songbirds.
Yeah, maybe we can find someone to do a whole duck molt webinar for next year. But again, thank you so much, Colin. This was such a great webinar. And again, this will be posted on our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again. Our next webinar, it's going to actually be our last one of 2021. It's going to be on Thursday, December 16th. And Matt Wibb, who's one of our avian ecologists, he heads up our MODIS network. So he's going to do a webinar all about MODIS. And that helps us track wildlife without having to recatch them like we do with banding. So it should be very informative as well, and a good one to kind of end the year off. We also have a bunch of other programs going on right now. So feel free to visit our website. Our events calendar has all of our camps, which our summer camps just opened. So if you have any kiddos or grandkids that want to come to our bird camp, let me know. Registration is open for winter camp and day camp. And we have a bunch of fun stuff coming up. So check out our event calendar. And again, thank you so much, Colin. This was a great webinar, and I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday week and safe travels to anyone that's traveling.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Bye, everyone.